准备了3个艺术世界的特制鸡尾酒，希望大家开心品尝。
这个是3个世界论述的提升版。
This has lychee wine, lychee 酒 for Renhua. It has vodka for socialist realist art, and it has Coca-Cola for 国际性的资本主义的 art.
3个世界的酒精，谢谢大家。
The first panel will be moderated by and guided by Johan Hartle, Professor Hartle, and the speakers are Johan himself, Valerie Doran, the editor of our book, Liu Tian, and Professor Huang. Please, thank you.
I'm only going to speak in English because some of you have your simultaneous interpreters headphones, and I don't want to make you suffer with my bad Mandarin accent. So basically, what we're showing here is just some short images from the exhibitions in January last year. So there was the Hanart 100 exhibition of 100 art objects, which was curated by Johnson Shiming and Liu Tian, leading a group of students, graduate students from the Hangzhou China Art Academy, or Academy of Art. And there were also 2 shows, one at Hanart, which was a documentary show, and another one at Hanart Square, which is a huge space in Kwaichong factory area. And each of these spaces had a different story to tell. So we just put together some slides also of the symposium. You get a sense of the kind of atmosphere that was happening at the time, a lot of sense of collisions, things coming together and happening. One of the important objects of the 100 objects, which very few people got to see, is actually a Cultural Revolution film that was finished, I think, in about 1970, but it was created during the 60s, and it basically documents the creation of the Red Flag Canal. This was one of the big socialist projects of the communist era under Mao, and it actually shows the peasants of this village in Henan province banging a hole in a mountain. And the film is 40 minutes long. It's a very rare footage. And I think that when we look at it, we understand something that Liu Tian talks about in his essay in the book. He said when they were curating the show, they felt that every one of the objects spanned at least 2 of the 3 parallel art worlds. Somehow they touched on at least 2. So that would be the world of literary art, traditional pre-modern, the world of socialist realist art, and the world of global capitalist art. And I find that I'm only going to show you about 5-6 minutes of this footage, but I think that within this one film we can actually see something about literary art in the sense of what inspired it. And then we can see certainly the socialist mission and this kind of socialist realism. And global capitalism we can see because so much of the source material of contemporary Chinese art comes from this kind of a paradigm. So we're just going to screen that first, about 5-6 minutes, and then we'll go right into the panel, if that's okay with you. Okay, thanks.
毛主席教导我们愚公移山，改造中国。 林县是我国著名的大寨式的先进典型，也是我国水利战线上的一面红旗。胸怀朝阳占天地，迎来春色换人间。英雄的林县人民以大寨人为榜样，高举毛泽东思想伟大红旗，自力更生，奋发图强，苦战10年。特别是在无产阶级文化大革命的推动下，终于在太行山的悬崖陡壁上筑起了一条人造天河——红旗渠。红旗渠的建成，从根本上改变了临县的面貌，把过去10年久旱、吃水贵如油的旧临县，变成了渠道往山头，清水到处流，旱涝都不怕，年年保丰收的社会主义新山区。过去，临县境内群山林立，沟壑纵横，土薄石厚，水源奇缺，粮食产量很低，是有名的荒岭出山头，水缺贵如油，豪门逼租债，穷人日夜愁的穷山区。全县共有500多个村庄，竟有300多个村庄严重缺水，很多村庄连一口吃水井都没有。有的村庄虽然有吃水井，但也是井深水浅，取水非常困难。因为缺水，全县有1半以上的人力则常年翻山越岭，跑到几十里外的地方担水吃。 解放后，邻县人民在党的领导下，兴建了一些水利工程，解决了部分地区的生产和生活用水。但是，由于邻县境内水源不足，遇到干旱就要渠道断流，水库无水，严重阻碍着邻县人民的社会主义事业的发展。敢想敢干的邻县人民，遵照毛主席“水利是农业的命脉”的伟大教导，决定到山西境内去劈山倒河，彻底解决水源不足的问题。他们要把漳河拦腰斩断，逼水上山。然后再劈开石子山、老虎嘴等50多座大山，凿通42个山洞，架起几十座桥梁，修建一条宽8米、高4米3、长140华里、引水量为25秒立方米的总干渠，把漳河水引到邻县的分水岭。再由分水岭修建3条总长度为230华里的渠，把水送到邻县。总干渠和3条干渠修成后，还要修建481条总长度为1896华里的支渠配套工程。在配套工程中，要打通75个隧洞，架设91座渡桥、14座电站和3000多个水库池塘，使全县形成能灌溉、能排涝、能蓄水、能发电、工农业都迅速发展的社会主义新山区。
Okay, what I'll do is I'll play the rest of it during the break, so if anybody wants to see more of this incredible film. But I think that we can see sort of the landscape, the kind of incredible rugged landscape that inspired so much ink painting and later interpretations of that. You can see, I think, early video art with a moving line. Also the incredible project of nationalism and you know, trying to fulfill the vision of the Communist Party, which is what this was all about. Also the way they used ink painting, you know, to represent the landscape when they're trying to show diagrams is quite interesting. And the maps remind me of Cho Jie, who's in the book. He's created a series of maps. And I think also what we haven't seen yet, but later you'll see them actually using explosives to dynamite through the landscape, which also touches on something that Liu Tian, Huang Xunquan, others in the book have talked about, which is Gao Shiming, of course, the destruction of the natural world in order to build the nation. So in the next panel discussion, that's going to be some of the things that we're going to look at. And I'll also just be showing some slides in the background here, which I think sort of touch on this concept of nation building. So Johan and Huang Xunquan, Lao Shi, and Liu Tian, Shifu, if you could have a seat. And as Johnson mentioned, Johan will moderate this first panel. It's going to be a very casual discussion, so also please feel free to participate.
Yes, thank you very much, Valerie, and Johnson, of course, for setting this up. The main framework of the book with the idea of 3 parallel art worlds probably is an attempt to approach or to outline aesthetic and art theoretical modes of approaching the different lines of tradition in contemporary Chinese art. We're discussing something else now in the panel, as we're asked to discuss the question of nation building. But this, of course, this question can be asked against the background of these 3 specific art fields as well. And we've seen some of it here as specific national traditions, like landscape painting, etc. Let's say the starting point also for re-inscriptions on the body of the nation in, let's say, progressively modernist projects, like the one that we've seen here as part of the socialist narrative. So Johnson suggested that modernity, the project of modernity, is very strongly characterized by the idea of nation building. And I would like to ask you both to speak a little bit about the ways in which the question of nation building, the question of nation, is addressed by the three respective paradigms. And just to give some first keywords, maybe, it seems obvious how the literati tradition, certain cultural and also religious tradition are playing into the ideologies of specific cultural and national contexts. It is ambiguous, just like modernity is in itself, when it comes to socialist culture, socialist realism, as on the one hand, of course, it was a project of nation building, and building really in the literal sense of constructing a nation, and not only in communist rhetoric, but also in social democratic rhetoric, the idea of construction and progress have always been very, very central. So most of the social democratic newspapers in 20th century are either called Aufbau or Fortschritt, progress or construction. So it seems to be very central for that project, also in terms of nation building. But then again, it is partly an internationalist project that also already undermines, just as much as capital has, always, the idea of cultural specificity. And that, of course, seems to be some aspect of, the global paradigm and the paradigm of, let's say, global market-related cultural and artistic practices, that they are, on the one hand, informed by national traditions, nationally specific cultural traditions, but that they are also standing for, and I've already suggested that, for something like a disrupting and disrupting logic of globalization. So if you would address the question of the three parallel paradigms in light of the question of nation building and the cultural importance of these paradigms for such projects, how would you approach it?
其实我刚才在 Valerie 放那个片子的时候，我注意到一个事情，就是大家都忍不住好像都笑了。就是我觉得，这个笑的原因我们可以慢慢来探求，但是它已经说明了我们和这个片子之间的这个距离，就是它有一种落差在这里面发生。所以我想先说的一个事情就是说，因为这个红旗渠的片子也是我们在汉100里面选中的20世纪的100件艺术物中之一。那么我会把它非常强烈的放在我们今天的这个当下的这个背景里面。也就是说，我们来这里的理由，其实很多人到这里是因为旁边的这个艺博会 Art Basel。那么这个艺博会上的这些物件、这些艺术品和汉雅100里面的这些艺术品之间，它是一个什么样的一种张力、一种关系，以及我们为什么在汉雅100的计划里面不去使用艺术品，而是使用艺术物这个概念，就是 art thing 或者是 art object 这个概念。那这里面其实就存在着一个非常非常巨大的一个区别，包括Basel 它作为一个瑞士的城市，它开始了一个艺博会的全球化的旅程，蔓延到香港，蔓延到迈阿密。那么这个里面其实在刚才我们在上面品尝到了一个3个艺术世界的鸡尾酒，其实我觉得是尝起来是甜的，但实际上这杯酒我觉得可能它不应该是一杯甜的酒，它是一杯苦酒可能。而且这个时候这个鸡尾酒的状态可能是我们应该去打开在我们原先的那个就是那个表格之中所表述的平行的艺术世界，就是它应该是寻找他们之间互相翻译、互相的落差、互相的嘲笑，以及互相的斗争的这个可能性。然后再回到Johan的这个关于这个national building 的这个问题，我觉得在红旗渠这样的一个和自然的一个改造关系里面，它其实是一个是以一个塑造自然的过程，但是循环过来是为了塑造主体。那在今天，其实我们最大的一个问题是，我们去塑造的那个客体，可能 很难去，或者说你的敌人很难去找到，所以你使得你缺乏一个有力的途径去重建你的主题。大概说先说
到。这是一个很大的题目。其实那个红旗渠那个片，他在后面其实还讲了很多关于铁娘子军的故事嘛，就一群那个妇女，她到地下区，然后跟男人一样的工作，甚至比男人还勇猛的一个铁娘子军。那非常符合文革时期他们那种女性撑起半边天的那种东西。那我记得这部片虽然时间是发生在真正拍是1973年对吧？但是它描述的是1960年代末的事情。几乎同一个时间，其实洪实业曾经写过一篇文章，在谈在1971年到75年中间的法国的所谓的革命电影。他讲了三个片子，像那个片子我有点忘了，可能那个陆老师最熟。其实很简单，就是讲当中国在制造一个集体，就是它是真的有集体性的，看到人民的一个集体的力量的时候，西方的左派根本毫无能力触及到真正革命的问题。换句话说，他们只能从形象上去喜欢左派。那我的意思说，那时候大概有几个势力。第一个势力是整个第三世界跟亚洲的解职，从新加坡、马来西亚这一波解职运动，以及非洲北边的解职运动。那作为西方核心的国家，像美国、英国、法国，那他们其实只是在影片里头描述他们对革命的期望跟期待。所以洪实业举的第一部片子是，对不起，我现在有点忘了那个名字。总之，他讲了3个故事，有一个非常有名的法国左派导演，他第一部片拍革命的故事是一群女孩子作为主角，站在抗争的现场，指着警察跟军队骂。这是第一部片。后来同一个导演在2年后又拍了第一部片，好像叫什么红旗什么的，我有点忘了，跟红旗渠那个红旗是一样意思。那第2部片以后，他拍同一个导演，他拍另外一部所谓革命的片子。那这部片的最后的那个女孩，就以女性为主的这个主角，她不站在最革命的现场，她站在那个警察在欺负劳工的时候，她站出来指着那个警察骂人。这是第2部，就第一个是女性作为一个集体革命的主体，第2个是她是捍卫、抵抗那些被欺负的劳工而站出来指着警察骂的。到第3部最有趣，第3部那个导演的结局是这个女孩子一样作为一个运动者的女性，她牵着男朋友的手，然后 kiss goodbye。你说革命这个事情从革命的主体慢慢变成是一个形象的主体，就说我爱我的爱人，是因为他在革命之中，我并不真的爱革命，可是我很爱革命的形象。那其实洪实业是透过这个3个片子来讲那个西方对于革命的一个想象。那这个其实我以前在北医大曾经整理过一篇文章，就在谈这3个细节。那我为什么这样讲？是因为这个东西其实如果以台湾为例，我们到90年代以后，台湾遇到一个其实中国也是一样。其实1989其实不仅只是台湾的问题，对吧？整个苏联瓦解，然后64，然后台湾的学运，基本上是1989到1990年代发生的。所以那时候我们其实很多譬如我那时候作为1990年代3月学运的一份子，在台湾，那其实我们是参加那个革命过程的。那我常常在我现在回想起来，我参加那个学运的过程里头，其实很像洪实业那个片，就是革命其实离我们很远，但是我非常喜欢我旁边的女同志们，就是跟我一起上街头对抗的女同志们。那可是这个东西，我的意思说，这个东西其实到了2001年以后，2001年以后，整个东西变得更明确。譬如说，你看娄烨拍的电影，像《颐和园》，对吧？其实革命不是很重要，对吧？重要是爱情，特别是就革命中的爱情会让爱情很珍贵啊。那2001年以后，台湾的一部电影叫做《男朋友女朋友》，其实也在谈1990年代3月的学运。那里面其实学运只是背景，也就是说，在一个激烈抗争的政治社会变革里头，爱情更容易发生。其实他们最终谈的是爱情。那我为什么这样讲？是因为我 因为我的出身的关系，就我在那个文章里头谈到，作为一个我在台湾算是有一个比较难听的说法，叫做偶尔罕籍，就是一半一半，就说我爸爸是从1949年才到中国来，被国民党带来的，他14岁被抓去当兵夫，因为那时候一家人就要出一个男人嘛。然后我奶奶听说花了很多钱，本来被抓2个，花了很多钱救回一个儿子，然后一个儿子被抓去当兵。那我妈妈就是他们好几代移民到台湾的人，所以对我来说，那个远方的革命总是很远的。就是我应该说，中国跟我的关系，在我的日常生活中其实很远，可是跟我小时候念的教科书很近。就我们小时候教科书要念中国的历史啊、地理啊，哪个地方产什么东西等等。那换句话说，我们对中国的想象，起码外于所谓的内地，我们对中国的想象其实也是一种形象的之爱，就好像那个电影里头的形象之爱。那这是我第一个想要谈的事情。那第二个是关于 national building 或 nation building。其实那个 Hobsbawm 其实写过很有名的书，他说，反正19世纪以后才开始有这个 nation 的概念，特别是现代国家的制度。那你怎么样证明你是一个国家呢？其实很简单，有一个 Hobsbawm 其实很大胆的下了一个假设，就是什么叫做国家？就是你开始有能力侵略别人的时候，大概就好像是一个国家了。这是一个历史学家的看法。那从这个东西来衍生的话，其实我看到这个 nation building， 其实有一部分其实跟血缘没什么关系，可是它跟文化血缘很有关系。也就是它是一个 second nature， 不是 nature。就我小时候念教科书，然后告诉我应该属于什么样的文化，属于什么样的国家，我的界限应该在哪里，我应该说什么样的语言，我应该爱什么地方，爱什么人。这其实是个 second hand 或者 second nature， 它不是一个好像真的跟血缘有关系的东西。那所以我觉得我在谈 nation building 的时候，一直非常的困惑。比如说，台湾早期在谈60年代我们在谈的乡土运动，其实我们的乡土是中国。在1960年代，台湾乡土是很明确的就是中国。到1970年代发生一个乡土论战，那个乡土其实开始有分裂了，就是一派的乡土是中国，一派的乡土是本土。那个状况很像今天香港发生的事情。到1990年代以后，我们的乡土已经完全没有中国了，我们的乡土就完全是台湾。所以在这种二次所谓 second nature 的指导过程中 ，nation building 其实讲简单，它就是一个人工的、非常 artificial 的东西。我不相信有任何一种天生的国家或天生的文化。那也就是因为这样，所以这个展览里头，我们更应该要珍惜那些物件里头说出的矛盾的地方，或者那些物件没有说出的地方，而不是他们稳固的一些历史界限或分段的概念。恰恰好，我们应该避免这个事情。这样，也就是说，刘田跟摄影团队非常很努力的把这些100个物件放置在3个不同的世界里头，可是他们同时也警觉到这样放是非常危险的，因为我们并不是要固定这些国族的界限，而是要让历史是连续的、复杂的、矛盾的。那所以每次看这个物件的时候，会让我想到很多以前我在念历史，或读那些教科书里头所谈的历史的真假。我就最印象最深刻，就是我看到那个设计那个中华民国中国国徽的那个梁思成的那个国徽，跟于右任的那个，这是一开头嘛，所以那开头就印象很深。各位知道，因为那时候刚好在这个展览结束之后，于右任先生写的那个民族救星，还有立法院，那个立法院的招牌刚好就被台湾的学生给扯下来了，就是懂吗？就是我在这个地方看那个于右任先生写的那个书法，然后同时在台湾发生很多事情是，于右任先生在台湾写的民族救星所有的招牌全部都被拆掉了，连立法院那3个字都被学生给拆掉，这不就是靠着历史告诉我们的事情？这样，就我先简单讲到这里。
Johan, would you like to
I would like to follow
address
up
this?
in a minute, but first I would actually like to ask you, as the one who's most familiar with the whole conception of the book and the specific contents of the various texts. Now I've asked our two friends and speakers about perspectives that probably go beyond the text that they have written, but to which extent is the question of nation building addressed by the various texts in the book? What would you say about that, and how would you think that it is a central subject of the structure and content of the book?
Oh, I think it is one of the central questions. And I asked Johnson, because he talks in his introduction about the project of modernity, and he says that the Chinas, the Chinas that exist with different ideologies, it's not so much a question of actually different Chinas, but about different takes or approaches to the project of modernity. So then I asked him, well, what is the project of modernity? How do you define that? And he said, well, one of the most important aspects of modernity is nation building. Because as you said, nation building is a second nature, it's a second construct. And I think that throughout the book, the question of building a nation, also analyzing and critiquing the nation once it's built, and then attacking the nation, throughout. And also destroying the nation, or as Hamad Nassar talks about, the partition of the nation. So that this idea of a nation is very, very central in everybody's consciousness. But also, as Huang Sun-Chen just pointed out, what exactly does it mean? It's really a personal construct as well. And the idea of xiangtu, the idea of caogen, these all go back to something that Liu Tian talks about, which I think is so important, the idea of the folk. The idea of the folk, the people who are not politicized yet, or who are not part of the modern constructed economy in that state. Everything actually in the end maybe goes back to that state. And who are they? And I think that the Hongqiqu, the Red Flag Canal, those are the folk actually. In the primitive state, kind of, you see them being pulled into nationhood. So this is all very, very interesting. And that's why I think it's basically opening up an interesting can of worms, rather than, a very particular and solid construct.
Yeah, thank you. I think one thing that both of you addressed, and that is also very strongly present in the setup of the book, is indeed the question of collectivity, but also the question of subjectivity, giving form to certain, literally subjects of the state that need to be produced because they don't necessarily already exist, second nature. And in the film, The Red Flag, that we've seen, the construction of collectivity, but also the construction of a certain relation to, traditional landscape and previous nature is quite central. It's one of the aspects, or one of the questions that Johnson's work has also very strongly been inspired by, thinking about the film project on the Confucian Li and the specific rights and rules of conduct that come with it. Bodily techniques, so really forms of biopolitics, constructions of the body. Can you maybe also address this? Because this is one of the things that we haven't really addressed very expansively or explicitly in the three art world text, but that certainly is at the very center. Yu Chang, maybe you want to start thinking about that.
对，我觉得刚才他所谈到的这个，就是如果我们在这里面增加一个关于身体或者主体以及它相应的链接的这个项目的栏目的话，分栏的话，可能是非常非常有意思的，就涉及到这个生命政治的这个问题和相应的对它进行约束和管理的这个方法，因为它我们刚才说到这个红旗渠对于主体的这个塑造，其实最后是落实在每一个参与劳动过程里面的这一个个人的这个肉身上的，包括我们后来在图像上所看到的这些人物的形象，其实这是真正最后它改造出来的。其实包括我们最后的历史记忆，其实也是在这些人的肉体上面体现出来的。所以我是很同意说，关于这个身体的选项，我们在那个三个艺术世界的这个框架里面有必要去再增加一个。但是呢，另一方面我们要就是接续我刚才所说的，就是说三个平行的艺术世界，这个平行可能是现在我们需要去进一步思考，甚至是要再度去搅乱和打破它的一个框架。因为平行意味着在数学上它意味着永远不相交。那么很显然这其实是在现实中是一种提纯的一个状态，是实际中是不可能出现的。包括我们在100件艺术物上也是发现，任何一个艺术物上都至少存在着两种我们所谓的这个艺术世界的框架。 所以呢，就是我认为，包括刚才我们那杯鸡尾酒，其实鸡尾酒它曾经是一种疗法嘛，就是它其实曾经成为了这个治疗艾滋病的一种疗法。重要的是，我们从这个配比的过程里面，可以形成对于当下的这个困境的一种治疗。
他的问题很难。刚刚刘田大概回答了那个 Barty 就是或者生物统治的事情，可是我觉得，我们做一个大胆的假设，因为它是一个论坛，所以我不需要太严谨。就简单讲，就是在谈身体或者主体性怎么被规训的过程里头，我们先谈一个事情，就是 nation building 或者我们任何一种 nationalism， 它基本上是一个 realist， 它基本上是一个现实主义者。我的意思说，这整个国家透过各种文化跟血缘的打造过程里头，它需要一个现实主义来激励人们做认同，透过血缘、透过道德、透过所谓的共同文化等等，就是他必须面临的 people 要的东西，而且 encourage 他们觉得他们自己是一国的这种概念。可是这种 realist 或者 realism，它是一个非常强烈的武器来锻造一个国家，也同时锻造每个个人成为一个one of这个世界的人，但它同时也是一个，如果你认真的从 realist 的角度来看，它同时也是一个解除神话有力的工具。我为什么这样说？就是我前阵子去年10月份，我带了中国美院的学生去了十里店做那个调查。那各位知道十里店，它大概是中国历史上最有名的一个土改的基地，就是当初的克鲁克夫妇们他们拍了非常多十里店的照片。于是它就变成一个传奇，好像就是十里店是一个由农民自发的第一次主动的参加中国土改，而且那时候还没解放，解放前，在1947年左右。那很多人就抱着这个克鲁格伟大的形象回去找那个土改的根源，也就是说，这是历史上第一次农民作为革命的主体，好像不是被动员，他们认真的作为主体嘛，好像没有一个国家开始叫他们要革命，他们就自己起来革命了，非常的 automatic， 非常的 autonomy 的这种事情。但是如果你去实体店，你可以看到一些非常多的东西，因为实体店其实真正的地主很少，大部分是中跟中下农，这也是为什么他们的主体会作为一个革命的主体会这么的明显的第一个原因。第二个原因是，他们对于富农的看法，其实跟我们现在或者甚至马克思、毛泽东的看法是不一样。富农并不是指有钱人，而是指为富不仁的人。也就是说，他可能很有钱，可他做了很多坏事，趁这个机会把他干掉。所以实体店之前有4个地主被农民集体埋葬，这是个非常惨烈的故事，就是挖了一个坑，就把4个地主推下去就埋了。那这4个地主并不是真正有钱的人，而是稍微有钱，可他做了很多危害乡里的事情。也就是说，你如果从民众的角度来看，你很难说他是地主，他那个主体性又跟所谓政府或由上而下毛泽东所谈的那个土改是不那么一样的。为什么他们支持土改？是因为他知道我们集体把财产分了以后，我拥有的会比我们现在的多。这好像马克思问你，就是各位你们如果都同意，我们现在把全世界的财富重新分配的话，照理说你们应该都同意的，因为你现在得到一定比你现在你未来得到一定比你现在拥有的多嘛？我不知道，这边可能很多人很有钱，不过 in average 来说，应该你会比较多，但是你不敢嘛，因为你怕失去财产。可对实体店那些人来说是的确的，他重新分配土地，他一定会比他现在拥有的多。所以，如果你把民众当作就民众这个东西，他有自己的 interest， 他有自己的考虑，你很难从福寇或者是很简单的生物权利的控制来谈民众。就我的意思说，我们必须经过更多的田野才能够仔细谈，否则我们就很快的到一个 format 里头去，好像我知道 bio power 有 knowledge power， 就变成一个很简单的理论构成关系。我觉得那个你要真正去了解民众是非常困难的事情。这第一个。第二个是，我为什么做一个现实主义者，同时是一个解除神话很有力量的工具，是因为你如果像去实体店看，一个曾经这么丰硕在历史上有名的村落，现在变得非常的破败。 破败的是每一个人家里可能都有新的房子，可是公共环境非常的差。我举个例子，就是在实体店，1946年开始做土改，从私人财产变成公有财产，然后中间又经过了2、3次的土改。在这个土改过程里头，有一个水池，那个水池本来是为了要众人，为了那个村子里头的共同灌溉，而潮的一个水池，所以他们就一起那个村民集体去潮了一个水，做了一个水池，还淹死了2个人。可是如果你现在去实体店，你看到那个水池臭得要死，整个村子里头的环境没有被整理，所有的村子里头污水都排在那个池子里头，你很难想象这个池子里头曾经为了公共利益而死了2个人。那如果你从这个角度来看，你就知道一个现实的神话怎么在资本主义的过程里头，就一个社会主义的典范，怎么经过私有化的过程里头，到目前为止连公共的东西都不见了，所以已经没有除了财产是变成私有化以外，所有的空间只要不是自己的财产，那空间基本上是没有人管的。我觉得这是中国面临最大的问题。那所以我觉得我有点讲太多，就为了回应就好的问题，就是说，如果我们要谈 Bardi 或者谈 Biopower， 其实它有一个非常复杂的东西，你不太可能把民众当作是一个好像永远被动的等着你去被处置的对象而已。这样。
Johan, would you like to respond to that?
Well, there's much to be said about this. There are hardly any concepts that are so complicated and unclear, and in that sense also so much subject to political constructions as the concept of the people. Yeah. So even a statement like we have to see or the people have to be regarded as passive presupposes a certain definition, which presupposes that there is something like a people, and that's probably already a problem. But again, I would like to come back and also to address Valerie in that sense, to the structure of the book, because I think partly our discussion reflects this. The book has a very interesting, not the single text maybe, but the structure of the book as such, a very interesting deconstructive logic. Yeah? So we're coming up with an attempt to map particular developments in Chinese art, and then a great number of the texts are actually trying to undermine this model very clearly. So Liu Chang emphasizes that there is no such thing, ontologically speaking, although it might make sense analytically, like a clearly identifiable representative of one of the three art worlds. Yeah? There are always mixed forms and mergings. Boris Groys's text basically argues, well, the problem of the parallel reality of three worlds and the merging of three worlds is nothing specifically Chinese. Yeah? He finds the same in the work of Pavel Althamar's work, so a Polish artist. Mm-hmm. And just to name one more example, John Rajchman is very critical of the attempt to map contemporary artistic practices, as the very idea of contemporary art seems to be to allow for emerging practices, for newness and innovative practices, and that obviously cannot be reduced to any kind of structural, systemic analysis. So speaking about these, let's say, deconstructive moves that the book makes, how would you see that, having edited it and having struggled with the variety of different perspectives in it?
Well, I think it brings us back to the three parallel art worlds cocktail, actually. Because in a sense, what the book is doing is stating a position and then opening up the trajectories from that position. And I think that for me, as an art thinker or a historian or whatever you want to call me, it's always about starting from one place and seeing where that leads me. So I think that that's one of the reasons why we put Boris Groys in the beginning of the book. So Boris Groys is talking about a Polish, basically a performance artist, or who creates these performance artworks with this one particular project with basically townspeople, the folk from a place in Poland, and he brings them out into the world. I think that is really a reflection of something, again, that Liu Tian talks about, that you talk about. And then Hamad Nassar, who is talking specifically about partition, Pakistan, India, he addresses South Asia, he addresses West Asia. And again, that's about that construction of nation building and the deconstruction of it, and tradition crashing into globalization. You know, I mean, the Chinese model is very important to understand because it's a huge part of our human civilization. And once you understand that, it helps you to understand or begin to understand or question a lot of other things. And I just want to mention another aspect I find so important is Lu Xinghua's question. He says that collecting, because all this work we're seeing is collected by Johnson Chang, a lot of it previous to working on this book and some of it prior to the concept. But he says that collecting is always about the future. It's about what future are we imagining that this work is going to have validity for. So I think that the book asks that question as well as a construct in itself. Yeah.
That's a very beautiful outlook on the second half of the discussion, actually. So you allowed us to look into the future for several reasons. First of all, because you addressed it explicitly. Secondly, because you addressed the work of Lu Xinghua. But thirdly, because one of the ways in which the essay that Johnson Chang and I have written together is addressing the question of the developmental logic of art through the constitution of outsides. Yeah? So the question to which extent futures are part of contemporary practices by the exclusive logics of institutional frameworks. Yeah? And I think this is precisely what's going to be discussed in the second half of the forum, the question of the outsides of the respective three art worlds. But before that, of course, there is room for discussion with the audience and for questions from the audience. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much. The second session will be Professor Lu Xinghua from far left, and Professor Meibao Ching, and Professor John Rajchman. I was instructed to speak about this other part of the three art worlds, which is how, since when we talk about worlds, each world is, of course, some form of a construct, whether it's ideological and is a structure. And so there is something of the outside. And there are certainly not just three, but there are the outside and the beyond. And what can we make of that? To think about this, I think the more untidy business of historical experience or making sense of art experience can be an interesting example. So I just came up with two observations from artworks in that list. One would be, for example, the type of art which would be analogous to what you saw in the calligraphy that you saw by Doran, who was included in the book to represent the type of art that represented the opening of the new republic, the inauguration of the National Republic in 1912. But then, in those days, every one of these old mandarins could write beautiful calligraphy, and not every one of them would be artists. And it is the, but, I'm sorry. Sorry, it's why was that? What? I am sorry. I didn't realize why I can't remember why I took that example. but we can still carry on with that example, because after all, the type of world they represent they are the people who actually were anti-revolution. There are people who were against revolution who would not be in the same league as Doran. They would be the people who were doing the type of calligraphy, but also would be banned from either one of the new Chinas, whether it was on one side of the Cold War or the other. So would that be a kind of the outside of the three worlds that we are looking at? And would that be part of the third world, this traditional world they were looking at? But then there's also another thing that they represent, which is another type of social political order, which was the old Confucian order. Then there's one other example which I thought would be quite interesting, is the naive artist Hong Tong. In the art world preceding modern China, he would not have been considered an artist for sure. He was a folk artist, and worst of all, he was illiterate. But then, when he was 50 years old, he decided to become an artist. He was a farmer and sort of a mountain trader. And when he was 50 years old, he did something really out of the ordinary. He cooked his wife a meal. And then he went on his knees, and his wife was of course, flabbergasted. And he said, from tomorrow on, I'm going to become an artist. And I'm going to stop working. So Hong Kong, in this tiny little town, tip of Taiwan, where there was not even a car road, no cultural institution, decided he wanted to become an artist. So Hong Kong is a very interesting case because he's totally immersed in an old Taoist imaginative world of this animated shamanist type of imagination, but suddenly realized that that can be art. And it would have only worked with the art world, and it would have been outside the art world coming in. So these are untidy accounts of history, which I thought would be interesting to think about. But really think about the outside. The question we're asking is, what opportunities are there that we have not yet explored? They're still lying out there for the contemporary art world that we are engaged in today. And for example, Hong Kong is one thing we can think about. Is folk a resource? But folk is also very problematic. We go to any interesting place in the world today, China in the countryside, there are a lot of people producing folk for the visitors. So folk has now been commodified to a very large extent, or they become individual artists like Hong Kong. So in one sense, they enter in one way or another, they enter this global capitalist system. So what would be the authentic folk that we still imagine that can be good resource for art? There's one thing that is interesting. And also, if we look back at China only a few decades back, in Mao's era, almost everything traditional in China was outlawed. People were punished for any connection to the past that was seemed to be the feudal past. And the legacy of this carries on into today. For example, only about 4 or 5 years, or 3 or 4 years ago, when China legalized more than one traditional holiday a year. There was the Chinese New Year, and now we have like 4. But then all the other holidays still wait to be liberated. In many other practices, I think even until now, you publish a book, or you want to publish in a traditional format vertically, it is still outlawed. But the fact that it's outlawed means that it's actually outside the realm of acceptance. So would this make this a resource? Will this make the whole tradition world a resource? So with these reflections from my side, I do not know if it coincides with anything that could be of interest. So I would like to start with Professor Rajchman.
Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation to take part in the panel as well as the original conference. As Johan said, I had lots of doubts about the very idea of 3 parallel worlds. And so in my contribution to the book, I sort of spelled them out. And part of my idea was the idea of outside. So I think there's situations that are outside the usual histories and institutions which are sources of invention or creation. And I wanted in my essay for the book to describe a little bit the rise of contemporary Chinese art after Mao Zedong as involving a space like this, an outside space. So in reading over the volume, and thanks to Valerie and the efforts of everybody putting the volume together, it seems that there's an overlay of another question. Gao Shiming is not here, but in his essay, he says that this story of contemporary art that starts after Mao Zedong is in effect over. It's an act that's over. We're in some kind of intermission period. It's lost its mission statement, he says. It's not supported by a cultural movement. And in Johnson's contributions, he says that it's a very complicated era which still needs to be digested. But instead of three parallel worlds, it seems that we have two modernities, each of them with their countercultures and with a shared past. Strikes me it's a very different picture than the three parallel art worlds. Parenthesis, on the previous discussion of the previous panel, I think the idea of nation state, very complicated, European modern invention that was taken up in Asia. I think the literati tradition, I wouldn't use the word national. I'd prefer to use the word like imperial to describe that tradition. And the proof of it is that the Chinese tradition you find in many national contexts, Japanese, Korean, and so forth. And in the book, Johnson's essay on writing, very much part of that heritage of this link between writing and power that comes from the imperial sources. I think, just to finish these remarks, that the effect of posing the problem in this way of the two modernities is to include much more Taiwan and to give Hong Kong a much more complicated role as this kind of zone of negotiation between the two modernities. So I wanted to know what my Chinese colleagues thought about that. And maybe one final remark about the aesthetics. In Valerie's presentation, she talks about the socialist world as a world of realism, but that's an aesthetic category. I think if we look at the history of modern art in Asia, we find that there's an early phase in Japan and Taiwan in which the issue of abstraction is much more important than the issue of realism. So, and I think now we're in a situation where the realism-abstraction division no longer quite so central. And maybe one final remark, this is just a series of questions maybe for everybody. We now have lots of discussions in New York about what's transnational. And so we want to have a history in which this very complicated and unresolved story of what happened in China is situated in a larger history that involves places outside of China. So when we talk about a shared past and going back to a shared past, I just have a little bit of a worry that we're enclosing the possibilities of contemporary Chinese art now within too much of simply a Chinese perspective. I think that we should open it up a little bit more to a transnational one. So just some elementary remarks to get the discussion going.
I would like to go back to the book because I was very delighted when I got the book. Originally, I thought it was just a collection of essays, and it would be pretty boring. But then it turned out that it's something more than a catalog and a collection of essays. And what I immediately think of after reading the book or flapping the book is that because I'm a historian, so it looks more like a chronicle than a catalog. And I really would like to add a time dimension to the whole of the discussion. Obviously, there are three worlds, and worlds or cosmos are made of time and space. And apparently, space are better emphasized, but not that much time. And for the three worlds, it might be easier to define the beginning and not the end yet of socialism. But for the so-called traditional or literary world, I think it's quite tricky. I can't figure out very clearly the beginning, and I'm also wondering whether there's an end of that particular world. And also, it's also true for the global capitalism, because of course, the global history or global capitalism started, you may say, from the age of exploration, 16th century, when and China interacted with that part of history, you know, in a very, very active way, especially when the Portuguese arrived at Macau and brought into almost half of the world's storage of silver into China, which transformed the economy of China in a very drastic way. And this is also how China began to imitate other, the national project of other parts of the world, namely the British, the French, and then the America, and turned itself into a something modern nation state. So three worlds are blended together with each other in a very, very complicated way. And, but I still find the catalog or the catalog.com collection essay a chronicle in a way that the artworks were apparently placed in certain chronological order. Perhaps it's also affected by the chronology that I, as a historian, are familiar with. For example, I know very clearly that the first piece of work is my Yuren, but I always think that the draft of the 人民英雄纪念碑 the monument was the first piece of work. I don't know why. Probably because it marked the beginning of PRC. And to me, it's not an artwork. It's an archive. It's a blueprint. It's something that I should have read in the library. so that mixed feeling, you know, as a historian, as a spectator of the art exhibition, in view or facing the object, treating it as an archive or a piece of document or an artwork, make me find the catalog particularly, or the book particularly interesting. And I would also like to say that it is also a piece of work representing the sense of history held by the people who were involved in the art exhibition. Obviously, every one of you have a certain sense of history and chronology. You wanted to put forward an alternative chronology. And this also affects how you place different pieces of works in the 5th and 6th floor of the Bauhaus Gallery. And as far as I can remember, there's also a real chronology placed in the basement, and that tried to illustrate history in a textual way. I remember we have some comments on that chronology, but as a historian, what I was not doing on that occasion was not to point out the mistake that might have appeared from that textual chronology. What we find very interesting is the narratives of that chronology also represented how all these people were involved and why they select this incident or that figure and placing them into a certain chronology that you find rational. So I would like to start this discussion with this particular emphasis on time. All right.
I think I will respond to Baoqing's mention of the monument to People's Hero in Beijing. I think it's also the first thing that after the revolutionary victory of the Communist Party, they started this project as a very important one. I talked with Boris Groys about this structure. He told me that it's about death, because in China and also in Soviet Union, people when they watched the monument, it somehow gives them consolation that in 200 years' time, all the heroes will wait for us to be with them. So if we have this monument, we just can be very confident. It's dying is a very desirable thing. So it's very interesting because I think it's a key, one of the key issues about how people at that time understand their own living and dying. And the project, and I think the only issue I would try to make about the original plan of the so-called the three parallel worlds is about the definition of the word, world. It's difficult because we have Badiou. Alain Badiou says that we are not living in the same world, but we pretend to live in the same world. We are living in the same world, but ruled by different logics. So now we do not have equality, but he tells us that the rule of general equality, the general equivalence of money, were already ruling us for more than 500 years. So if we have the way to overturn that rule, we could have like instant communism realized at our face. So what is the world? It's difficult. So I think if we cannot understand how we live in the same world, we can get some help from Johnson, because Johnson has a collection. Because I think a collection of artworks could be a very good substitute for the world we pretend to be living in. So I think that's the importance of collection. Now, within the collection, I think we can do categorization. It's difficult for people to understand what had happened in the past, but if you do it in the collection, it's easier. So Valerie has done a very good job, and he also showed, you showed a very good example to us. What can we do about it's a very big issue. It's about what we can do about the 20th century China. So I think the Johnson's collection is not a collection about the 20th century China. It's a collection of the 20th century China. So I think that's, for me, that's very important. Then I would turn to my views about the why the collection is so important in other ways. I think in my classroom, it's always difficult to raise issues about our past, because in the students, they have different views about the past. So I think history for us in China, in the mainland, it's only about kind of techniques of narration, right? So in China, I think it's very difficult to really talk about history because we need a historiography. We have to find a storyline to help our young men, young women to tell a story about our past. So that's the reason where we thought about the concept of the three worlds. If we cannot tell one story, it's easier for our students to tell three stories. That's easier. So that's why we chose this kind of concept in Hangzhou. So this actually the Gauss means ideas, but I developed it a little bit. And so we needed to find a proper, reliable historiography for us. And but before that, we can use Johnson's collection as a theater or as a classroom to do this kind of thing. But we have serious issues here. If we read Friedrich Nietzsche always told us that we make very bad use of history, because we take history as already fixed, already done, already taught. So that's very dangerous for him. So later on, I think Michel Foucault suggested that if we follow Nietzsche, we could use other means to tell the same story. So I think if we can find the historiography for my students in China, or if we use Johnson's collection, I think we need a lot of work on the genealogical and archaeological parts of our history. That means we can sometimes delete, insert, or invent even. So it's not about like the recording of the 20th century China. We can do a lot of inventive work about that part of history within Johnson's collection, maybe. So this is my second point. The third point is about the sublimation of the 20th century China, because I think after my generation, people have a very bad view about my grandfather and my father's cause. So many times they feel very shameful about what my grandfather and father had done. And so we need to like find ways to make the history of the 20th century China extraordinary. So we have to find some techniques of history or of storytelling. So if we have the chance to look at the works in the collection, I think it's possible. Because both technically and aesthetically or politically, I think the artists have provided us wonderful materials. And I think if we can use them in my classroom, it will be fabulous. By fabulous, I mean to make it a fable. If the history is too problematic, let's make it a fable. That's better, I think. Thank you.
Well, there are three very interesting propositions of how to break open from the worlds. Of course, this definition can be problematic, but one thing which I want to go back on first is what John has mentioned about talking about the national. Of course, a lot of authors have mentioned this in this book because the big story for China in the 20th century is called nation building. But even that term itself, nation building, is problematic because by submitting to nation building, you're already committed to a modern cause. And it's precisely the issue that is being questioned here, whether what is this nature of the modern cause, and what is the material manifestation in art that can show us or reveal some secrets to us. Of course, if we have Professor Lu here to tell the story, we can have either something that will make us feel very happy about our grandfather, or can also make us feel very bad about him. But certainly, this issue of the story of the national is now done. And Professor Rajchman's point that we should be speaking about the transnational. But then, speaking of the transnational, we are now again retreating from this whole issue of talking about the modernity as a whole. So, if you go back to art to speak about this project, let's see. If we take the position from today, from contemporary art, since this is where we're starting from, in contemporary art, we say that, well, the modern project has been now superseded by something which is more open. Maybe it's transnational, or maybe it is even more than that. But certainly, now everybody has a voice. The problem with this voice, I think, is one issue that the three art worlds wants to bring up here. Firstly, the contemporary art platform, well, of course, we need some sort of definition for it. And I think in here, building this kind of framework, the three art worlds, we're assuming one thing is that the contemporary art world is very much a platform about the negotiations and contestations of different types of ideologies, shades of ideologies. And if we define the contemporary platform that way, then we have to say, if the contemporary situation for China, if we talk about contemporary situation in China, we still need to connect with, even in art, we still need to connect it back with an art history. But in fact, we cannot go back, because from contemporary Chinese art, we can only go back to modern Chinese art, which is a reaction and reflection of its engagement with European Western culture. But then, from there, where do we go? We will say we go back to literati art. So this is the source of the contemporary. So perhaps this is the third art world. This is it's not the outside, but it is the other resource that we're looking at. But in fact, technically, it does not really work, because unlike a European historian, you can say, what I'm doing here is a piece of art. I'm referencing the Christian religious art tradition or a different art movement history. But in fact, when you talk about contemporary, it is more than just that. You're talking about how these arts and its ideological past have framed the possible to make it something for the contemporary. So in one of the projects that is described in the book that we're doing, which Johan has mentioned, my Confucius project. Of course, this is my most ambitious project, trying to curate Confucius. But what that project really tries to do is to, if we look at contemporary art platform as a platform for the negotiation of ideologies of different, maybe it's different national ideology, maybe it's just shades of internal politics within a society, then you still need to go back to some sort of a framework that will give you resources, give you something from strengths from the outside. And in the Chinese, that's why the proposition of that is to look at the resource of something not just from literati art history, but from Chinese ideological history, and especially in ideological history in the proper sense of the word, because ideology is essentially a regime of the senses in every way, and the regime of the body, a regime of the ordering of the world, and that. So that is actually one proposal, and it's probably one of the optimistic readings of history, which Professor Liu has proposed.
Well, thanks for clarifying a little bit and introducing this project of the curating Confucius. It's something I don't know very much about. Sounds like a very interesting project. My one maybe hesitation about it is that it suggests that the only resources now are coming from this earlier tradition, as if in the modern world and in the contemporary world, or the socialist world and the capitalist world, there's no longer any creative impulses. Whereas I think the reevaluation and rethinking of Confucian, or more generally Taoist and Buddhist and the ideas that went into, or philosophies if you like, that went into literary art, will only have an important role now when we also, and at the same time, find new potentials in our contemporary, either capitalist or residual socialist situation. So we need to sort of combine the two. So that's, I guess, an added aspect. So maybe I'll stop there. I had some remarks about the idea of collection, but maybe I'll let the other people, you have respond as well. Yeah.
I'm always optimistic about history writing, otherwise I will lose my job. But what I would like to say is that I think history is about scrutinizing every concept, through documentation or various kinds of investigation, because sometimes you do not rely on documents that much. You might rely more on oral kind, etc. So it's always about rewrite and rewrite and rewrite history. I think this is also what the current historians in contemporary China are doing. So it's not that pessimistic in the sense that I think there are a variety of historical narratives being transmitted in the classroom now. So this is, in a sense, that not that pessimistic. But I'm also pessimistic because in the 1940s, according to Frederick Mould, the very famous Ming historian, in the 1940s is the most historians are the most clever people would like to be historian, but it's now not the case. the clever people are engaged in the art world. And we, the less clever people, are being the historian. So I'm not very sure whether you might be able to rewrite the history better than ours. Okay, just kidding.
So I think about the contemporary art position as a substitute for writing histories, or as an excuse of not writing any of history. This is a very important issue in China, because Chinese contemporary art is always like more than itself. It's playing a political role in the West. So So it gives me the sense that by being contemporary, it's irresponsible, because you refuse to make decisions about what century you are living in, or even what kind of the world you are living in. You're waiting to be decided. So it's irresponsible. So we always heard the European professors visiting us told us that, oh, be careful, be patient, because China is changing. It's opening up. It's basically lifted up by the global capitalism. So recently, Bernard Stiegler also told me that, be careful, another 20 years, you will know what kind of history you are living in. So Chinese history would be formed by our new reactions to the global capitalism. You do not have the history after the Cultural Revolution, but you will have one in 20 years' time. So I think it's a very interesting view. But for contemporary art to play as kind of a permanent irresponsible way of I have said refusing to anchor ourselves in any position. It's kind of really weird experience. So I think the Chinese contemporary art must be very corrupted.
Should we actually invite the audience to take part in the conversation? Would you comment on Professor Liu's pessimism?
Well, I think it's true that it's a task of scholarship, simply on the level of the history of art, to not simply imagine that contemporary art in China sort of starts in 1978 from nowhere. And it's obviously grounded and is related to things that went on in China before, not only in China, but in particular in China. So there's a long modernist. You evoked the British Empire coming, that goes back to the Opium Wars, and this June 4 movement, Lushan, all the stuff is going on. So I think I agree with you. There's a tendency to imagine that contemporary art sort of is on its own, and we need to see better how it fits within a history. It's a methodological problem, a problem also for exhibition. So I agree with you with that. I think when you say global capital, one of the reasons that contemporary art in China is so hard to insert in this larger research has been that it's so much dominated by the market. So maybe that's changing a little bit. No. Okay. But that's a problem that's we need as we now look at even this earlier period. That's the story of which is told in this book. I think maybe collecting it's part of it, because the history of the collection of this art is so much in private hands. So we don't have public institutions that make it available to people and for the students in your classroom and so forth. So I think there's a need now in China to try to get, and this project may be part of this. Johnson very generous in opening up this discussion, but there should be more, hopefully, that would allow this work to come into the public domain and therefore into these discussions.
I just want to make one comment about artwork and art production. Certainly one of the big problems now when art is self-consciously produced for the market. And so the market has become itself an impediment, or it muddies the water. But if we look at this as just one of these negative forces artists have to work against, because once you start to produce for the market, very often the artists will run to the ground, and people can see through them. So, so if you look at this situation today, they're getting rich, but they get run to the ground. In fact, is it not also comparable to the situation in China in the 70s and 80s, when there was no market on the horizon, but there was official restriction? So they were also fighting against some sort of impediment. And the impediment, in fact, can be itself one of the parameters that make art art. And the second thing about what the significance of artwork, because now the problem is that there's so much stuff out there, we just have to walk across the street, and you will be able to spend your entire legacy. Is that collecting is making into an issue. So when you decide what artist is significant, or what does it do, then of course people start to say, we're looking for something that's authentic. But authenticity is a very touchy problem. It's like buying authentic folk art. There are many motivations we will make the folk art. So when is it authentic? Or is it not really made for the market as well? What really matters, perhaps, sometimes, if we remove ourselves from the motivation of the production, of the creative act, and ask what it really does, so long as there's some agreement that is worthwhile discussing, is when does it become a real catalyst for an experience? So I think that is the issue that we're all faced with today. And then collecting is, about collecting and the market, since we're in this world where the art actually depends on the market to survive. So one can really get away from it. But about this particular collection is, I'm actually a reluctant collector. Basically, I have all these things because I failed to sell them. We should open up to other people.
5 minutes. 5 more minutes. We still have 10 minutes of wine and coffee upstairs if you want to run. Thank you very much for coming.